Strange but true stories. Tales from the light side, the dark side, and the other side. I'm Steve White. We're veering from the paranormal path with this episode, going down more of an abnormal splinter trail, and this detour is more of a trail of terror. So a question first. When is someone considered dead? There have been different determinants throughout history. The cessation of breathing, the heartbeat stopping, the ending of brain activity, or brain death. With today's medical technology and understanding, it would be inconceivable for someone to be declared dead, then buried, only to learn later that they were in fact alive when they were entombed. It's a concept that is absolutely terrifying to imagine, though. It's been used in television shows, movies, and books, but in the majority of those instances, being buried alive was intentional. Check out Tim Crabbe's The Vanishing for that horror ride. But we don't have to look too far into our past to find instances where people were declared deceased, and yet they weren't. Before there was modern medical equipment that would definitively determine when a person had died, many feared being buried alive and took measures to ensure that didn't happen. Some had a coffin crafted with a rope inside that would lead to a bell or flag above ground that would alert anyone strolling by that, I'm not dead yet, mind getting a shovel? Taphophobia, or the fear of being buried alive, was at its most pronounced in the 18th and 19th centuries. Now back then, a doctor was not needed to declare someone dead. And with cholera, smallpox, yellow fever, scarlet fever, typhus never too far from anyone's door, the unfortunate folks who succumbed to these diseases were buried in a hurry. And as you can imagine, well, there were a number of folks who ended up being buried alive. But even in the so-called modern age, there are still historical recollections of people being buried prematurely. Consider the case of Angelo Hayes. Hayes was born in 1918 in France and grew up and came of age between the two world wars. He was known to be a bit of a risk-taker and occasional daredevil. He could often be seen riding his motorcycle along the country roads and lanes in his part of France. In 1937, at the age of 19, Hayes was riding along on his motorbike, but he took a curve a bit too fast. He lost control, went into a ditch, was catapulted off his motorcycle, and went headfirst into a brick wall. When locals discovered his body, he was lying motionless and did not appear to be breathing. He was gathered up and taken to the local hospital. The doctor looked upon a horribly disfigured face, checked for vital signs, and determined that Hayes was dead. His parents were notified, but after rushing to the hospital, they were not allowed to see their son because his head and body had been so badly mangled. Arrangements were made for his funeral, and he was buried without haste. Now, his father had apparently just recently taken out a large insurance policy on his son, maybe trying to hedge his bets with a risk-taking 19-year-old zooming about on his two wheels of terror. He was laid to rest, but questions from a curious insurance investigator attempting to confirm that Angelo was truly dead prompted an exhumation of the body 2 days later. It's not understood why he didn't take the word of witnesses to the crash or the doctor who examined him after his accident, but it's a good thing for Angelo that he didn't. Tools were brought in, the coffin was raised, the lid opened, and the body in the casket was still warm. To the dismay of the doctor, a faint pulse was detected. He was rushed back to the hospital, where it was determined upon further examination that he was truly alive and had been in a deep coma, which allowed for less oxygen, which kept him alive inside the box. Several surgeries followed, and a few months later he recovered enough to leave the hospital and return home. Now, this is all happening in the 20th century, less than 100 years ago. The ancient Egyptians were embalming folks thousands of years ago. The practice really came into use widely in the United States during the 1860s and the Civil War. Yet Hayes had not been embalmed, which, again, was fortunate for him. Hayes became a cause célèbre in France. He did the equivalent of the 1930s talk show circuit as people came to see him and hear his story of being a modern-day Lazarus. And the guy knew a thing or two about branding. He designed what he called a security coffin that would support human life for up to 30 hours, which featured a radio transmitter, a chemical toilet, and a library. Because, if you're going to spend eternity on your chemical toilet, you may as well have something to read. He toured around with his security coffin in the 1970s, reliving his harrowing story to all that were interested. He demonstrated his invention at a fair in Saint-Eulalie, France, in 1974, where he went all David Blaine, spending 30 hours in his souped-up coffin. Then in 1984, he hung out in it for 2 days. His special brand of marketing didn't really take off, though. There haven't been many copycat versions made, and though I haven't been coffin shopping lately, or ever, I would think showroom coffins are more of the banal silk pillow and lined walls and less toilet seats and the latest Uncle John's bathroom reader. Well, anyway, Angelo made the most of his years after his near-fatal crash and his more nearly fatal interment. His life was a life well lived. In 2008, he passed away and was officially laid to rest at the age of 90. Edgar Allan Poe was intrigued by the idea of being buried alive or being mistaken for dead. One of my favorite stories is The Cask of Amontillado, where a man is bricked up and left to die a slow death in a small underground wine cellar. There's The Premature Burial, written in 1844. The narrator in that story suffers from catalepsy and fears, being buried prematurely. And then there was The Fall of the House of Usher, in which Roderick's sister Madeline becomes sick and then catatonic and then presumed dead. These stories, being written in the 1800s, were works of Gothic fiction, but they preyed upon the fears of the time, which were grounded, quite literally, in some fact. Have you heard the story of Essie Dunbar? Miss Dunbar had epilepsy, and in the summer of 1915, in her hometown of Blackville, South Carolina, she suffered a powerful seizure that laid her low. A physician was brought in to care for her, but when he arrived, he noticed no breathing or heartbeat or any signs of life. She was declared dead. Soon after, she was placed in a wooden box, and preparations were made for her burial the following day. Her sister lived in Augusta, Georgia, a little less than 50 miles west of Blackville. Now, in 1915, zipping 50 miles down the road wasn't a day trip. It took some doing and some time. But her sister arranged to be there for the funeral the following day. At 11 a.m. on the nose, the first of 3 ministers began the service of remembrance and burial for Essie Dunbar, though her sister had yet to arrive. Thankfully, for all concerned, the service was a long one. The second minister gave the eulogy, talking of the things Essie had done in her short 30 years on this earth, and all that she would certainly miss. Still, her sister had not yet arrived. The third minister began the final part of the service of interment and the casting of dirt by friends and family. The remains of Essie Dunbar, concealed in the pine box, were lowered into the grave, and the final words were spoken. Finally, her sister arrived at the gravesite, frantic to see her sister one last time. She created quite a fuss, and she would not be denied the opportunity of peering upon the face of her sweet sister one last time. The ministers finally relented to appease the grieving sibling. The dirt that had been tossed onto the top of the box was dusted off, the coffin raised, the screws removed, and the lid lifted for a final farewell. But instead, it was hello again. Essie Dunbar sat straight up in her wooden box and smiled at her astonished sister. Needless to say, but we'll say it anyway, this caused quite a fright. One of the ministers fainted, falling headlong into the grave, suffering broken ribs as a result. The other 2 were too flummoxed to speak, only able to look back and forth at each other and mutter incoherently. And then everybody started scrambling away, sure that Essie Dunbar was a ghost. Despite being prone in a wooden box for a day, Essie climbed out and started pursuing friends and family members in hopes of understanding what was going on and why they were so frightened of her. The mourners were now convinced they were being chased by a zombie and ran off toward town screaming in a frenzy. When Essie returned home later that day, her neighbors were dismayed and a bit unnerved by her resurrection. They were convinced she was otherworldly, but as time went on, she sorted back into normal, everyday life, and after a few years became a local celebrity as her story was told and retold. Essie Dunbar lived another 46 years, until she died a natural and final death at her home in 1961 at the age of 76. I'm a fan of the author Randy Wayne White, no relation to me, but a heck of a writer. Now, one of his recent books I read in his Doc Ford series was titled Dead Silence. One of the things that happens in that book is a kid is buried alive in Florida, and Doc has to find him in time to extricate and save him. Whether Randy got the idea from the recesses of his creative mind or pulled and reworked from a real-life occurrence, I don't know. But there is a true story of that happening as a means of torture and extortion from the 1980s in the Chicago area, and the results were tragic. In the early morning hours of Wednesday, September 2nd, 1987, Stephen B. Small received a phone call. The voice on the other end identified himself as a Kankakee, Illinois police officer and said that a building that Small had been renovating had been broken into. He was asked to come to the building to see if he could identify if anything was missing. He kissed his wife, told her where he was going, and walked out the door. That was the last time she would see him alive. Small was the son of Burrell Small, who had been president and CEO of a media company that owned several newspapers, 11 radio stations, and 2 cable television stations. His great-grandfather had been the governor of Illinois in the 1920s. They were a wealthy family, and 39-year-old Stephen was the heir to the Small fortune. And on this morning, he was a target. He was abducted and taken to a remote location. He was placed in a 6-foot by 3-foot coffin specifically built for the purpose of imprisoning him while the kidnappers waited for their demands to be met. There was a crude ventilation system built into the box. He was given a gallon jug of water and a light that was attached to the leads of a car battery. After being placed in the coffin, he was lowered into a hole 3 feet deep and covered with a mound of sand. At 3:30 a.m. Wednesday, Small's wife received a phone call from the kidnappers, who demanded $1 million in ransom. The caller said Mrs. Small would find her husband in a box if the ransom was not paid. They received 4 more calls from the abductors. The family was able to distinguish another man's voice, and a woman also made one of the calls. One of the phone calls was able to be traced to a payphone in Aroma Park. The last call on Wednesday came just before midnight with a promise of another call Thursday evening. But Thursday passed with no new call or message from the kidnappers. The waiting was excruciating for the family, and they were desperate for any information on where to go so they could rescue Stephen. The family was willing to comply with the demands, pay the $1 million ransom, but the quality of the tape-recorded message with the ransom drop location was so poor they couldn't understand where it was to be left. Friday, September 4th dawned with no news on the whereabouts of Stephen or the drop spot. The waiting continued with zero contact with the abductors until at 7 p.m., Small's 1987 maroon Mercedes was spotted by an air patrol and located by officers. 3 hours later, canine officers hit upon a mound of sand in a location about 8 miles south of Kankakee. As quickly as they could, officers dug through the sand, located the box, and opened it to find Stephen B. Small dead. He had been dead for several hours. The official cause of death was listed as asphyxiation. It was determined later that the tube was insufficient because a small box with vents had been built around the tube's opening into the coffin. He was unable to get his mouth around the tube to draw air into his lungs. Using a phone trace and surveillance methods, it wasn't long before police zeroed in on the kidnappers, arresting a trio on Sunday, September 6th. Arrested were a 30-year-old small-time drug dealer, Daniel J. Edwards, his girlfriend, 26-year-old Nancy Risch, and the third was later released due to an alibi and insufficient evidence. The deputy chief of police for Kankakee said, "They planned it. It wasn't a case of, today we're going to do it. They built a box. They put a ventilation system in. They knew a little bit about where he was going." But then things went horribly wrong. 2 years later, in May 1988, Edwards was convicted of murder and sentenced to the death penalty. The prosecutor in his case asked the jurors if they could imagine a worse way to die, standing in front of the homemade coffin in the courtroom. In 2003, his death sentence was commuted to life in prison. Risch was convicted of helping with the plot hatched by Edwards and is serving a life sentence. Earlier this year, she requested a new trial on the basis that she was the victim of domestic abuse at the hands of Edwards. Now, I'm not going to say that living in a 9x13 cell is comfortable, but it sure beats suffocating in a 3x6 box buried underground. This has been another strange but true stories. Let us know what you think in the comments below. We'll get back to supernatural, paranormal stories next time. We thought we'd just stray briefly from the norm and follow a path less taken. Like and subscribe if you are so inclined. Sign up for notifications as well so you know when the next video drops to the channel. We appreciate all the support and thanks for watching this video. I'm Steve White. Until next time.